Hi there, I'm Christina, and welcome to my podcast. Nuance Beauty is intended to be a spot where I'll capture some varied thoughts and challenge us to hold to our opinions loosely so that we can see the beauty in others and in ourselves. I want us to dive deeper into those everyday topics or those sticky topics and thoughts that we might shy away from or bulldoze over others with our opinions. Because I think if we all thought exactly the same, there would be no need for anyone else. So let's get nuanced. Welcome back to Nuance Beauty. This week, I realized after chatting with a friend that of all the episodes that I've put out so far, I have not directly answered what is nuance. And that kind of leads into why do we even care about nuance to begin with? So, with that, I thought I would bring back my lovely husband, Bill. Welcome, Bill. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. The other episode hasn't aired yet, so we'll see.
See what the ratings and reviews say.
We'll see if I should be welcomed back. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, thank you for joining me. I thought it would be nice to have Bill in this conversation because he hears the ins and outs of all the random thoughts that I have and all the topics that I kind of ponder and I kind of think would be fun to discuss on the podcast. And so I have a feeling that he will be able to describe what I think of nuance from a different light because he hears so much of what I have to say about the topic and kind of like the heart behind it. And yeah. So with that, what is nuance? So when I was thinking about putting out a podcast last year, I was tossing around the name Engage Well Today. And uh, as I was considering what I would talk about on a podcast and how I would even format it, like what would be the point? Why would I even be talking? Um, I was thinking about Engage Well Today because I think that we should actively have conversations with people. And I'm not talking about social media rants. I'm talking about actual conversations with the people in front of you because I think it totally changes the dynamic of a conversation when you're looking eye to eye with a person. And so Engage Well is what came to my mind. And then I tossed that around. I kind of like mulled through it. Do you remember that being?
Oh yeah.
And you didn't like that. I think you also were
Oh,
kind of
I
like,
very
it's not very
specifically did not
catchy.
have an opinion on it.
Ah. Yeah, and I kind of like, well, engage well. Maybe I could just call it engage well. Or I thought like engage well today because I wanted to kind of be talking about just relevant topics that we would care about, our current culture today, what we would want to talk about.
Right, and thinking about it at the time, uh, a lot of events were happening in a very rapid succession in 2020, 2021, 2022. So, thinking of what is happening today and how can we engage in these topics
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's productive. Uh, yeah, it kind of lends itself to saying, well, today, the present tense, what is happening today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that like the key word is like, how can we productively engage? And I tossed around that title and it just didn't sit right. And then the thought came to me one day that like nuanced is kind of like a word that was standing out to me. It's kind of like a word,
Yes,
whatever, Bill.
it's indeed a word.
It is indeed a word.
Gold star.
And it stood out to me because um, I have strong opinions on a lot of things. I have very strong opinions, but I also, whenever I come up with a strong opinion, I've thought about the other side frequently, and I've chose not to take that stance, and I've chose to have this opinion. But I have found that in having productive conversations and productive relationships, um, you have to leave space for people. And it kind of ties into that very first episode where I dug into like how to get comfortable with nuance, which was really like almost like I don't know, an ode to myself, like a reminder to myself. Is that not a good use of the word ode?
Uh,
Does it work?
well, I think if you're saying an ode to yourself, it's saying a song,
Mantra to
a
myself?
song. No, an ode would be like a song of like worship to yourself.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay. So that's not quite right.
no, I think
So
that's good.
like a mantra, maybe mantra, like a mantra to myself. Like
Mhm.
how can I be productive in relationships and go into conversations and just like enjoy talking with people and um like really feel engaged but also feel like the person that I'm talking to feels valued. Um because if I get too heated on a topic or I get too in my own head or too like, oh, here's what I think about that, I found that it kind of like shuts people off and like, oh, okay, like there's no room for me to speak on this.
Yeah, I think we've grown for as much as we are uh, conflict ridden. Where in just as many ways conflict averse. There's an old Family Guy episode that shows two dogs barking at one another through a fence, and then the fence gets removed, and the two dogs run away from each other because we think about oh, there's so much conflict, but there's far less conflict between two people speaking because
Hmm.
there's either an aversion to conflict of like, oh, you disagree with me, I'm going to leave before I feel like I'm going to get yelled at, uh, or, and this is what I think we hope to do in our lives, there's a meeting of minds like, oh no, I see you as a person who I disagree with wildly, but you're a person in front of me and I'm speaking to. And in that way, conflict is reconciled rather than averted.
Hmm.
Um,
And like you're saving the relationship.
mhm,
You're allowing a relationship with another person.
mhm.
It kind of like, oh, it reminds me of the book, The Coddling of the American Minds, or Coddling of the American Mind or American Minds. I can't
I
remember.
think it was singular.
It was probably
Yeah,
singular. Yes, the American Mind.
super not boring. Continue.
Yes. But in that they talked about the like the dwindling of diversity of thought and how like we've kind of gotten to this space culturally where to think differently than someone is a blatant attack on that whole person and like well you must agree with me like to be friends with me, like we have to be on the same page to really get along. And I think if anyone really thought about that, like you just know that you've never entirely gotten along with anyone.
Yeah.
Like it's not really possible
Hmm.
to have everything in common with another person. And that's actually in part of my like summary, my little blurb of what this podcast is. If two people thought exactly alike, there would be no need for another person.
And in fairness to your friend, I want to go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. The opening intro to the podcast is exactly 60 seconds long,
Yes.
which is 2 clicks of the plus 30-second icon in
Y-
Spotify.
yes.
It is designed to be
To
skipped.
skip over. Yes.
So, if you miss the definition,
In the
uh,
intro.
it
And
is
there's like the pretty
understandable.
music, so
And
you're kind of lulled if you do
yeah, you're
listen to
you're
it.
you're you're completely lulled into the comfort of beautiful music. But I do want to say that I so admire this person for saying, I don't know what that means. Can you describe that to me? Because
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I will just keep the conversation going
Uh-huh.
and hope I
I
figure out
figure
the
out what it
definition
means.
through context.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It takes a certain level of courage to be willing to say, hey, I don't know what that means. Can you explain that to me? So I
Right.
wasn't there for that conversation, but I was blown away by this person's humility to be willing to do that because that was.
Yeah. And it's a good question because like I mean, you and I chat like as people, we both generally get the what. Like okay, so thinking about there's a book called Find Your Why or Start with Why. They're both by Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek. Yeah. And he does a bunch of TED Talks, and he has this like these three circles. He has like the what and the how and the why. And I feel like both you and I, we tend to like get the what kind of quickly, and I like to hang out in the how space, and you prefer to figure out the why space.
Because
And so sometimes when we're having a combo,
I need a
we
really good why before I'm going to put in the energy to do something.
yeah. And for me, I just care how things get there. Like, how do you get things done? Because I
Hmm.
like to get things
Oh,
done.
you have the energy to do that.
And I do, yeah, I do have a lot of energy. So, for me, like, I hang out in that how space, and I feel like I've dug into how, but just the simple, like, what is nuance? And so when my friend asked that question, I actually I guess I gave the most, we looked up the definition, and I gave the most accurate definition
Hmm.
based on the historical of the word nuance. It's derived, it's a gradient of color in the gray spectrum, derived from like a French word that describes clouds.
Yeah, from like old French, there's like a Latin word for cloud, then it evolved into French for gradient of color, and then presumably after the Norman invasion of England, and there's a mixing of French and English. The English took it as a subtle variation in a thing,
Hmm.
um, which
And that's kind of where,
what's so funny because she told me the story of oh yeah, nuance is about shades of gray, and there's a level of truth to that. But I also
like, you can have black or white, or you can kind of like see the gray in a
Mhm.
situation.
And even that is in a way a dualistic way of viewing things, black and white and gray.
Or
Gray
gray.
gray just being a mixture of black and white is still saying this is only two
Right, right,
possible
right,
things.
right. Yeah.
Uh, the way I was thinking about this, and it's interesting. Uh, I keep hearing the word nuance coming up over and over in different things.
Yes.
Uh,
We're
almost
all
like
on the
it is like
bandwagon.
that's the question. Are we on the leading edge of something great, or is this are we on a
Are we,
bandwagon?
yeah, are we behind
Um,
or are we ahead of?
and the vitriol and
The extreme.
the extremes of the last few years, I feel like there's a pendulum swinging back in the opposite direction, and understanding that there is a layer of complexity to uh, why people believe the way that they do.
Mhm.
And I think there are so few absolutes in the world, and we have been presented with no, these there are a lot of absolutes, and if you don't believe them then you're wrong and you have to like leave society. And
Mhm.
that's just so not
Discredit
true.
someone.
And yeah, and but there's so few, and this is not a distinctly Christian podcast, but we at Nuance Beauty are Christians, and so that does populate our thoughts with a certain number of absolutes. But even then, if you get deep enough into Scripture, there's even not very many there. There's a few that are like capital A absolutes, but even then, not that many absolutes. There's a lot of subtlety and complexity
Mhm. There's a
into
lot of like,
how
there's a
people can experience
couple
the world.
essentials, and
Yeah.
then there's the non-essentials. And like, so having space for the non-essentials and how it can be applied differently. And that's
Hmm.
like, that's kind of, that's a beautiful part of scripture. But there is like, even in the Christian circle, um a level of focusing on what to do and what not to do. But when you get into it, like, there's more about your motivations and your character development and
Hmm.
how you do that. And quite frankly, it's not like, a lot of ways it's not super clear how you do that, besides the example of Christ and
Hmm.
seeing how he lived his life.
Well, as
But
you said this morning, you can't open up Scripture and find out what you're supposed to eat today.
yeah, but there's so many topics that it's like, okay, well, what should I eat today? Or like, oh goodness, like, how much money should I spend on clothing
Hmm.
for a year? What should my budget look like for this? Like,
Hmm.
there's not clear guidelines for some of those things. And so, like, giving room to evaluate your own circumstance and do what works in your scenario, and it might look different for another person, but we can like our own individual stance of how we walk into a conversation, like say you're talking with a girlfriend and they share that like um they spend $200 on their
Hmm.
hair, and you share, you go to Great Clips.
Hmm.
Can you respect each other and just know that you both have a different perspective on that
Yeah,
thing?
and that goes into, you had a whole episode about, what it is that you value.
Mhm.
And you don't want to say that all things have equal like moral equivalence, but for how much you spend on your hair, there is nothing that says there's a moral absolute of how much you should spend on anything, really.
Mhm.
So in that circumstance, and in far more circumstances than you think, there is so much space for grace and nuance, and the thought that, oh, you think about things differently than I think about things, and that is okay.
And that's where like I think that's kind of the intent of this podcast is to explore these various topics that can be complex. But if you never take the opportunity to patiently listen or teach yourself how to hear opposing views, because I do think it's something that is effort on your part and my part, right? Like at least for me, it does not come naturally for me to actually sit and patiently listen to someone because I quickly jump to the next thought or I quickly make assumptions of where the topic is going to.
Oh yeah, she jumps to the end of stories that I try to tell her all the time. So what's the point? Well, I'm getting there.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, I do. And so, like, for me, this is a reflection exercise, um, and trying to battle against that internal, um, I don't know, bent toward just assuming a certain way, and then potentially placing a moral equivalent with a value, like adding that moral component to the value, and rather than just having that like freedom to conclude differently than the person across from me.
Mhm.
And then I guess that kind of goes into why we should probably say why be nuanced then, right? I mean, we touched on culturally,
Yeah, well,
like culturally it feels
you
like
said earlier in the conversation that if you know there's a thought that if you don't agree with me on things, you must not love me, or even you must hate me. So you cannot be my friend if you don't agree with me on every items. And if that's the case, you can't be friends with anybody. And
mhm
there is so much value in community, in being um, around other people, whether you agree with them or not. Um,
mhm
there's like a fount of resource there, and we talked about this in the hosting episode, the perspective, and and you can get into mental health topics in this. And if you uh, fail to acknowledge that people can be different and you can still love them, you will be very alone.
mhm
And it's not good for man to be alone.
yeah, yeah, or you'll have very dysfunctional or destructive relationships.
Yeah, until you have none at all,
Mhm,
or
mhm.
you have uh, people around you in your orbit, and you're just waiting for them to take that one step that they're no longer friends with you anymore because they believe whatever it is they believe.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like that's at like the core of like why? Like why care? And ultimately it's the relationship aspect that like we crave relationships. We're built not to be in a vacuum. And how do you have flourishing relationships? Well, a component of that is appreciating the differences that people bring to the table.
Yeah, and I feel like we're speaking in very general terms, but the truth of it is that we lost a lot of friends over the last few years over our beliefs on how COVID should be handled, and
Mhm.
how we as individuals should or shouldn't have to do this or that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And
And I'm sure we're not alone in that.
we're
Everyone
yeah,
concluded a little differently.
and just like you can't open scripture and have it say what you ought to eat today, there's nothing in scripture that says one should or should not take a vaccine explicitly. That's not there. So given that, people uh, came to different conclusions, and people who we walked with for years, we were non-persons following this one thing we disagreed upon.
Mm-hmm.
And in processing that hurt that we've had over the last couple of years, I think that is where this concept of no, we need to lean into this nuance really came from. Because absent that, absent the ability to um, see people as more complex and beautiful individuals
Mm-hmm.
than any label that we might want to affix to them, uh, it's going to be a very lonely place.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think that that's the other component of like the nuances. Like we personally had fostered a large community of friends, and to see so many varying opinions, and politics is still obviously hot and heavy in whatever topic. Um, we had enough friends and enough diverse friends that we truly loved, that we did get to walk alongside with. And while there were some disagreements in this and that, we also we really love these people, so we know that this can't be an all in or all out decision, and it is simply more complex. And had we not developed those deeper relationships and respect for one another,
Hmm.
we may have completely missed that too.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, we had people that we loved deeply who we deeply disagreed with, and because of that, and because we listened to them, we can understand their position.
mhm.
Didn't change the fact that you know that things ended up the way they ended up, but we still cherish the relationships that we had.
Yeah, and we definitely we want to continue fostering good relationships, and we want to continue growing with people. And it definitely being able to see people in their differences, and um, find some beauty in that, and the grace and the patience with one another to even listen and have your own stance be one that I know that there's some nuance here, and I know that that nuance can be beautiful because it helps me learn something new or refine how I feel about a thing. And that's really the goal here. So you got anything else to add? I think we
I
pretty
think
well
that
covered
covers it.
it.
And the only thing I might throw in is we talked about when we moved to Seattle, we lived amongst a lot of people who we disagreed with pre-COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and we loved that
Yeah.
actually because it allowed us to really focus deeply on what we believed, uh, religiously or otherwise, just things that we believed as a couple of
Yeah, and growing up in
rural
Midwestern
Midwesterners,
values. Yeah,
and so
yeah,
we were really challenged. And that allowed us to really let go of things
some
that
of the
were not true
right,
or not necessary,
like maybe the non-essentials that
the non-essentials,
can
and at the
see
same
differently.
time just cleave that much more tightly to the things that we still found to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And it really uh it's a lean system we ended up with, a very few things we had to cling to very tightly, and the other things we got to
Yeah,
um
we got to enjoy learning something
yeah.
different and a different perspective,
All
that
right,
and why that perspective exists to begin with,
I've
rather
actually been
than
very comfortable in Florida amongst so many people who agree with me. It's
yeah.
actually, yeah, it's way less
It's
fun for
so
sure.
weird. Yeah, we're getting adjusted to that
Mhm.
because we agree in some ways, but then there's also a lot of things we
Mhm.
don't agree with.
Mhm.
So we have our own challenges here too. There's plenty of nuance here. But yes. So, all right, guys, thanks for tuning in, and give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you as always. I'd like to take a moment here at the end to thank you for your listening. I know that there are plenty of podcasts out there that you could tune into, and I am honored to have you paying attention to mine. So, if you are loving what you're hearing, I would love a rating and comment or review and share it with a friend. And if you're not loving what you're hearing, please shoot me an email. It's nuancebeauty@yahoo.com. In all seriousness, I would love your feedback, and I appreciate you spending your time with me today. Take care until next time.